All right, folks, David Parsons here. Just wanted to say real quick that I'm putting up this Campus Trap episode on the Nostalgia Trap main feed because I think more of you should be subscribing to Patreon and listening to the conversations that Ryan Boyd and I are having about higher education. This is a good example of those conversations. We talk about third places here, all sorts of fun stuff. Go check it out. The link is in the episode description. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Folks, welcome to another edition of Campus Trap. My name is David Parsons, joined as always by Ryan Boyd. Ryan, how's it going? Good to see you.
Going pretty well. Good to be here in the trap.
Good to be here in the trap. It's getting colder here. We're both sitting here in our cute fall sweaters. It's time for cute fall outfits. Although in Southern California, that's one of the frustrations of living in Southern California is you don't get to wear as many cute fall outfits as you want to.
Yeah, I'm always jealous of people who live in like San Francisco or the Pacific Northwest because they can dress, right? They can wear layers. You know, you feel like you're going to die 6 months of the year here when it's so hot.
Yeah, that's true. Like weather-wise, it's just like I don't. It's just I don't know. You don't look cool in shorts and t-shirts. I don't know. I get sick of wearing that all the time, and yet like it's the only thing that's comfortable. At the same time, like I live in a suburb, so I don't live in LA. I live in a place where like you stick out if you dress here. Like if I were to wear like a blazer, it's like whoa, easy Nelson Rockefeller. You know, like it's like this sort of like class thing that you wouldn't dress that way. The only people that wear suits around here are like the guys that are like lawyers that are going to court or something like that.
Yeah, LA is definitely, depending on where you are, right? Some neighborhoods are less stylish than others, but you definitely see a lot of people wearing their outfits. And as soon as it gets below 60 degrees, the like North Face parkas come out, and you see people in like long coats, and it's like it's not that cold, guys. It's
those
put on a
Patagonia puffy jackets that everybody has. I swear,
Yeah.
at a certain point, because I lived near Park Slope, Brooklyn, for years and years. At a certain point, yeah, you could tell the season had changed because every Park Slope mom and dad had their like thin puffy Patagonia vest or jacket on at the Park Slope Farmers Market, and that's like it's that's how you know it's fall. Another reason you know it's fall is that school is in, and we're sitting here in the middle of a semester. I don't know how you're doing. How's your semester going, Ryan?
Surprisingly well. I don't feel that burned out yet like I did last year when we came back for fully masked in person. I'm still wearing a mask in class, but in general, stuff seems like it's back to a normal college flow. For better or worse, everyone's just stopped thinking about the fact there's still a pandemic going on.
Yeah, that's a bizarre place to be in, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's this like citadel of health and youth, right? You're invincible when you're in college. And, I know a lot of my students think that way. There's no way I could get sick or, be really ill.
We don't require masks at our school, and it's really mixed. But very few students in my class are wearing masks now. It's like gotten down, and yeah, and I really wonder what their attitudes are. I mean, I guess their attitudes are as varied as our attitude, as adults. I guess they're adults too. Sorry, kids.
Emerging adults.
Yeah, emerging adults. Is that what you said?
I think wasn't that the term that was being used for like millennials when we were in our 20s,
emerging adults. Yeah.
Emerging adulthood. It was like, you're 26 or whatever.
Yeah.
You still have roommates.
Yeah, it's like being a tween.
Mm-hmm.
A liminal category of human being. Well, I wanted to talk about third spaces. This is a conversation we've been meaning to have for a while. There was this great TikTok. I know that's a word, that's a phrase that usually doesn't come out of my mouth, but there was a TikTok that went around. I don't do TikTok, but because I don't put Chinese government spyware on my phone. But either way, I saw this one on Twitter, and it's an example of like a 2.5-minute lecture about third spaces and what this concept of third spaces means. it's something that means a lot to, I think, both you and me, Ryan, in terms of thinking about campuses and what college campuses mean, but it's also just about urban planning and about like how you make a city that's livable and cool. And we've touched on that a lot with thinking about coffee houses and record stores and things like that. So I thought we would sort of duplicate the awkwardness of a graduate seminar or even an undergraduate class where we watch a short video together and then we enjoy awkward silence until one of us speaks up about it. But let's watch this TikTok. I think this guy's a professor. I'll post this in the link. I'll post this link in the episode description. But let me make sure, and this is duplicating a Zoom class. I'm going to share my screen, everyone, so we can watch this video together. All right, here we go.
Let's talk about the importance of third places. A third place is somewhere people hang out that isn't home and isn't work. Like cafes, clubs, bars, libraries, churches, parks, plazas, barbershops, you get the idea. This concept was coined by Ray Oldenburg, who described them as the anchors of communities, where relationships are formed through spontaneous conversations and art and activities. And throughout the US, we've lost them. In his book Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam noted this has been a steady decline for decades, with dropping club memberships, church attendance, and other forms of social participation. Now, the causes behind this trend are complex and have to do with technology, polarization, institutional distrust, and the splintering of Christianity as our culture's default religion. That said, it's also largely perpetuated by car-dependent suburban sprawl. You see, all cities, big and small, used to have densely populated downtowns where people experienced chance encounters and supported local businesses with foot traffic. As Euclidean zoning segregated suburban housing from shopping districts, those places slowly died out. Then private companies tried to fill the void with malls as the new town square, which were dominated by big businesses. But then they started dying too when online shopping took over. So now we've lost most of our gathering places outside of major cities. The third places most suburbs have today are car-dependent convenience chains like Starbucks or lifestyle centers in some wealthier areas, which are all just consumer-centric businesses modeled after how on-the-go we've become. Plus, every town still has that one bar where everyone meets and then drunkenly drives home from. But those are often depressing too, because rather than being one of several third places, they've become the single place people go each week to escape their life's routine. Because if you have to drive over 20 minutes to and from work every day, you likely don't have the time or the energy to then drive to a third place, other than maybe on a Friday night. This is why people try to replicate community online through multiplayer video games and forums and social media groups. It's also how a lot of alternative scenes for skating and music are created in the suburbs by angsty kids who carve out spaces in basements and fire halls and abandoned lots. Good third places are hard to come by today. Ones that encourage regulars to just hang out for hours, talking to strangers or reading books with little to no pressure to buy things. Or ones that don't encourage rushing out the door with mobile orders. When you build mixed-use neighborhoods that combine housing with commerce, foot traffic can support these places. Not to mention, organic events pop up like block parties, barbecues, and yard sales. It's undeniable that technology has changed the ways we view community, but I don't think anything can replace the need for organic in-person connections that we get from third places. Without walkable communities, third places can't thrive. And without third places, we lose the heart of our communities.
All right. Without third places, we lose the heart of our communities. I mean, it feels like I don't know when there was a heart to the community. Maybe there wasn't. But it seems like I feel like I know what this guy's talking about, right?
Yeah, I actually wasn't familiar, or I'd read it and forgotten it. The idea of Euclidean zoning, which was, I think, is a really cool idea and a like really illuminating concept. Because yeah, I remember, going to visit friends. I grew up in the country, but if I visited friends in the suburbs that I knew from like, summer camp or something, it was just, you lived in one place and then you drove to another place, and the two didn't meet. And it wasn't until I got older and started reading about how like, yeah, like there used to be small towns had downtowns with like lots of businesses you could walk into, and just that wasn't my experience. I mean, we had a dying downtown because of Walmart in the town I grew up in Virginia.
It's funny that first of all, I want to hear more about you growing up in the country. I have a little house on the prairie sort of image in my mind now. But yeah, it's funny how this video, this TikTok, whatever you want to call it, this little lecture made me think about just like you did. The first thing I thought about was being young. Like I know he's talking about sort of like adult spaces, like bars and stuff like that, but he does mention like youth being a place. I don't know. When you're young, you really feel the lack of third places in communities, right? And you don't certainly have any language for it. But I grew up in a place that there, like by the time we were teenagers, I think that's where you really feel it because you like want to get away from your parents, but you don't really have a place to go. But yeah, we had like a mini golf place and a skating rink, you know, like that kind of place. That was like we got bored of going there again and again and again. It was the only place anyone could ever think of. Movie theaters were the other place that we could escape to. But for you, growing up in the country, what does that mean? It means like it means that you have a long drive to anywhere, right?
Yeah, I grew up in southwestern Virginia, like along the Appalachian Mountains, and it was a town called Covington, which was known for having a paper mill, and that was about it. There's a lot of logging industry, and our third place as teenagers, I remember, was when the Walmart Supercenter opened. People would go and like park their cars out in the huge parking lot and just like sit around and bullshit, and that was
Yeah.
kind of like the place you could go because like there were a few bars, but we were teenagers, we weren't allowed to go there, we didn't have any money. Occasionally like fire halls would host, like a buddy's band would play, or like the local Best Western had a conference room that bands would rent out, but there wasn't a lot of place to go. I mean, you were just kind of, I was living out in the countryside in my family's house, and I had to like drive into my little town. If I wanted to go see a movie, there was a little movie theater, but it never showed anything good, so we had to go an hour to Roanoke, Virginia. And
Wow.
that's where there was like a little indie theater where I saw things like, American Psycho and The Birds and things like
Mm-hmm.
as a
Mm-hmm.
teenager. But yeah, it was pretty isolated, and I know it's different than if you're in the suburbs where there's a lot of people, but there's still that weird zoning because
Right.
the people, it was, population's pretty sparse down there in that part of the state.
I feel like well, I grew up here in Ventura, California, which has been a develop. I mean, it's hard to describe as it's an old oil town that eventually developed into having a bunch of suburban elements to it. So there's a lot of tract housing, and that's I grew up in tract housing, but there was nowhere to walk to. I think that part of what he's talking about here is like walkable communities, right? And like I don't know what you encountered when you left your house, but when I walked, it was like through the tract neighborhood, just like kind of endless rows of houses that look the same, down to the green belt at the end of the street. Or then if you ventured past the green belt, you went into like a barranca and like the back of some industrial zone, where there's just sort of like gray buildings that people are making, paper or something in there. I mean, it was really kind of like almost like Stand By Me ish in the sense of like you can find the backwoods of the suburbs pretty easily because they're built so I don't know, they're built in such a like roughshod way over the course of years that there's just like a big Toys R Us near me that's sort of like okay, you can walk to the Toys R Us, but you're going to walk through a bunch of like fields with chain link fences around them to get to that Toys R Us. It's certainly not the image that you and I probably both experienced in 80s movies of like vibrant downtowns, like I don't know, a sort of like Main Street USA. That I longed for that, but that didn't exist where I come from.
I mean, I was always so jealous of people that I met who lived in cities or close to cities. Like, closest city to us was big city was DC, and that was hours and hours away. But Northern Virginia's there, so like summer camp, I would meet kids who were from like just outside of the city, and they would like take the train in to go hang out in Georgetown and do whatever kids do. And for me in Allegheny County, like our walkable areas were like the national forest where you'd go hiking or hunting or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
um, there really wasn't development at all. The downtown, I think, used to be thriving like after World War II, but it had been hollowed out by the time I was a kid in the 90s, and there were only a few businesses open. There was a good bookstore that I think of very fondly as like a third place. But it was mainly just like Walmart and the Kmart that Walmart killed off, that was there for a while. It got
Yeah.
replaced. So yeah, like watching movies and knowing people who lived in urban places or got to go there, I was always really jealous that there was just so much life. It just seemed really bland where I was.
Yeah, I wonder if that's kind of our personal sort of orientation of like, wanting the city, because not everybody does, and certainly people I assume that live in the country don't necessarily long for Main Street USA. They're looking for something else. And I don't know, it's hard not to see this video, this TikTok, as like about liberal values, right? Like liberal social values and how they've declined over the years, and connecting it. It's almost like I kind of wonder like what came first, the decline of the third spaces or the decline of the liberal values. But
Hmm.
it seems like I have to assume that not every American wants to like sit in a coffee shop and like have a salon like atmosphere. It seems like that experience is actually something that many Americans are turned off by. Like it's almost like a self-reinforcing thing. Like since we don't do it, we don't sit in cafes and like read together and have salon atmosphere, then no one wants that anymore. And it feels like it's like a breaking of a certain kind of social life.
And one thing that this isn't my observation, a lot of people pointed this out that the TikTok doesn't mention racism and how things like, once public pools were desegregated, suddenly private pools became a thing in the suburbs, which were, a segregationist project for white flight. So, that's also a big part of it is like once, I guess, more, of that space was open to people of color, suddenly a lot of white people fled it
That
and
is a
didn't want to be
really,
there.
really great point. And the whole white flight idea, not just as a literal white people leaving the cities, but like white people exiting the whole public, the whole idea of we're all in it together. Yeah, there was a lot of great books about that. The pool thing, but it's not just pools. It's like schools, right? It's
Hmm.
like every public institution you can think of. Public golf courses are another place where that happened, and all of a sudden you get this like private country club golf course thing that accelerates dramatically in the 70s and 80s. God, it puts like movies like Caddyshack in
Hmm.
perspective, honestly. That like golf and skiing and all this sort of like retreat from the idea of we're all on the street together. I mean, I think part of that is a nostalgia trap. There's always been an elite that sort of paid their way out of social life. But cities have a lot to do with it. I mean, you live in a city, and I lived in a city. I'll probably live in a city again at some point in my life, because the suburbs are just as, I don't know, as soul destroying as I remember them in some ways. Honestly, they're comfortable, but they're also like there's very little of that vibrant life, feeling like you're running into different kinds of people. And that was part of the, I don't know, that little bit of egalitarianism that cities maybe produce even as an illusion. It seems important, and I don't know if it's there anymore. Like car culture in LA completely destroys that.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I always feel like LA lacks in most places, most neighborhoods compared to like New York or Philly that have more just walking culture. Like everyone walks and takes the train in New York, and in LA, if you can afford it, you usually have a car, you take an Uber. I'm a weirdo who willingly takes the bus, but not many, professional middle class people do
It's like,
that.
whoa, Mike Davis over here.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely like thinking about these public spaces, a lot of the truly like open public space in LA you know has been just evacuated by the middle class.
Yeah, what
Buses,
are
parks.
LA's third places? I think it's funny because it's like in a lot of ways you think of them as like tourist places where people gather. I'm trying to think of like what are the non-tourist places
Yeah.
like Griffith Park is funny because it's like both a tourist spot that like every person that visits LA has to go up there and take a picture of themselves by that observatory, but at the same time I feel like people who live in Los Angeles go up to Griffith Park and like hike
Hmm.
around, and it's like a usable place.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, LA's got huge spaces like that, like Griffith Park, but there aren't pocket parks everywhere. There aren't, smaller green spaces that you really need on like a local basis. You look at really dense neighborhoods like downtown or Koreatown, there's been effort to build parks, but a lot of times they're like corporate partnerships sponsored by Visa for Grand Park downtown or whatever.
Mm.
It's not really like a public good. And the police are there to make sure that nobody who's unhoused camps out or, creates a quote unquote disturbance. They're heavily surveilled places. They're
Oh
there
yeah.
to get you to buy stuff usually.
Yeah, nightmare places. I don't know. I think of like Grand Central Market in downtown
Hmm.
LA as a great example of a modern third space in a lot of ways in terms of feeling like it's a food hall basically, right? Like a big
Hmm.
giant food hall and you can go there and like
Yeah.
eat a million different types of places. And that place has an energy to it that feels very like this is what we mean when we mean like a cosmopolitan place where people of different backgrounds are meeting and enjoying all this different food together. And there's a kind of social vibrancy to it. But you know what's weird about it is it's in downtown LA, which has kind of an odd. Would you call downtown LA like a walkable city? It feels like I have to like
Yeah.
drive in, find a parking space in like some awful like parking garage, and then walk around that area and then just go back to my car. And it doesn't feel like anyone lives there. I don't know.
Well, I mean, so much of downtown was changed by like redevelopment and car culture, like what they did to Bunker Hill, which used to be a, thriving, working class neighborhood with like cool San Francisco style houses and things like that. And it was ruined and, it's built over now. And the freeways carved up downtown. And, it's weird. Downtown is walkable, but it's not a super pleasant place to be usually. It's
Right.
there's a lot, it's a strange mixture of, $1 million lofts and then incredible poverty out on the street. And it's really unnerving to be there. You see LA's contradictions up close.
Oh, 100%. And it's not like New York. And what I mean by that is that when I walk on busy streets in New York City, there are people everywhere of all kinds. But in LA, the streets feel like deserted, and the unhoused population is sort of all that's around. And it's just sort of like you feel tumbleweeds going through. Like, I mean, it feels like there's an apocalyptic sense to it in part because it feels deserted by everyday people.
And I think some of the best neighborhoods in LA, like places like Koreatown that are really dense and diverse, have a lot of foot traffic all the time. And it's not, just people in their cars driving from place to place to go up the elevator to their loft and,
Right.
try to avoid the, people who are unhoused on the sidewalk because, rich people don't want to see that. Um, in places like Koreatown, where it is dense and there's a lot of like, working class people living there, it feels more like New York. And you feel when you walk around in those neighborhoods, like you actually feel safer because there's more just people out on the street all the time. Um,
It's so snobbish to me that to like think of it in this way of kind of like, oh, what are the areas of LA that are quote unquote like New York? Because New York is,
mm-hmm.
is like this too in the sense of it's become a kind of patchwork and of inequality, where there are places that are quote unquote nice that are inaccessible to people, and it's like that. But I think it really is just kind of car culture versus non-car culture, although everyone's driving in New York now, because the subway got so shitty, quote unquote, during the COVID years. So I mean, New York has these issues too, but I think of like being in like places like hipster areas of New York of LA, like Highland Park and places like that. Where I
Mm-hmm.
was like, oh, this is like Brooklyn. This feels
Mm-hmm.
like Brooklyn, and all that means to me is kind of what we're talking about, a kind of vibrant street where there are lots of different businesses open and people are going in and out of them. That's all that feels like.
Yeah, and it's kind of like I always think about what Mike Davis says, and I think it's in Planet of Slums where he says the future is fortified green zones and helicopters hovering overhead. And, that's how cities feel in a lot of ways. I mean, they're
Totally.
patchworks of enclaves and places for rich people to consume stuff, and, places even for like, middle class professors like us to go do things we like, buy records or get coffee that's not Starbucks or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's this kind of green zone mentality, like fortifying the rich areas, policing the hell out of everyone who isn't. Yeah, I mean, and campuses are like that. I mean, I sit in a private university campus that's got fences around it and gates, and the second biggest campus police force in the country, I think, after the University of Pennsylvania. Heavily policed, third space.
Oh yeah. I mean, and the college campus was, I don't know. It's kind of like, is it a third place? Because it's sort of like it's not work, it's not work, it's not home, it's school, and it's sort of
Hmm.
like, okay, where is school fit in that whole third place discussion is kind of a question. I was going to ask you before we get to the campus. Thinking about Bunker Hill, have you seen The Exiles? Have you seen that film? You know what I'm talking about? It's like
I know of it, but I've never
yeah.
seen it.
I've shown it a couple times in my in my classes, my LA history classes, because it shows Bunker Hill that you mentioned of the like 40s and 50s and early 60s before it got completely destroyed and turned into what it became. It's an insane story, but that movie is sort of like I don't know, it's almost got like an Italian neo-realist feel to it. And you follow these Native Americans from New Mexico who literally are like teenagers who fled the reservations to come to LA, and they're like poor kids. I mean, they're like in their young early 20s, but they're going to bars and they're putting like a quarter down at the bar to buy beers, and they're all like, dancing and partying in these bars. And the image of the streets of Bunker Hill with rings of businesses that people are going in and out of is just exactly that image of like, what the fuck happened here? Like, how could we have destroyed that? And in the documentary, what Los Angeles plays itself, the narration about they use the exiles a lot in that movie, in that documentary, and the the narrator basically says, this was at some point city planners were like, how the fuck are there this many poor people living in this area that's right next to downtown? Like, that's a real estate bonanza, and we're going to start the process of getting rid of them and getting rid of the entire area and turning that into like luxury condos, office spaces, skyscrapers. It's an awful fucking story, but that's LA, and it's not just LA. That just seems like it's like the direction we went.
Yeah, I just read this really interesting book by a geographer named Leslie Kern called Gentrification is Inevitable and Other Lies. She also wrote that book, Feminist City.
Very cool. Yeah.
Yeah. And she's fantastic. And the gentrification book is really interesting because it points out that often we think of gentrification in terms of like culture, like, oh, there's more record stores and like, guys with glasses and beards and like, wine bars and things happening. And we don't think about like the big flows of capital that sort of enable that.
Right.
And they're the real story. It's not just, hipsters showed up one day. I mean,
Right.
they're part of the
Yes,
story.
Of course.
But it's real estate developers. It's, one of our candidates for mayor, Rick Caruso, wants to turn the city into a mall. He's a real estate developer. That's his vision. And it's up against a more social democratic vision, still a liberal vision of the city and Karen Bass. But, this is LA's politics is real estate development.
Yeah. That's fucking slime bag shit. And it's Chinatown. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like it goes all the way back. And, when I taught at Emerson College in Los Angeles, right on Sunset Boulevard, we did an exercise. I had my students leave the room. I wanted them to go on like a little field trip. I told them to be gone for half an hour, walk one direction, leave the room and leave campus and walk one direction or another on Sunset Boulevard, and then come back. And I want you to take pictures on your phone documenting any signs of surveillance or carcerality, and we'll come back and we'll all share the photos we took. And it was fucking insane when they came back, because many of them, it was like 15 minutes. They hadn't even left the campus yet, because they were taking pictures of like the places where you had to swipe a card to make a door open, places where you had to show your ID to a security guard, locks, and locks and gates and cameras everywhere in the campus before they even left. And then once they left, of course, all of Sunset Boulevard is like that. There's sort of like this sense, and this is all pre-COVID, in terms of like, it's funny that the right wing freaks out during COVID about, oh my God, we're turning into a fucking police state here with your vaccination status. This is so Orwellian, etc. It's like, where were you, in the years where this surveillance state was being built? Oh yeah, you were supporting it and building it. Yeah.
I never thought this weapon would be used against me. What the fuck is happening?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading Malcolm Harris writes about this a lot, how people ask, okay, why isn't there a stronger like anti-war movement in the U.S. or more of a counterculture? And it's because, well, there's been a massive police state built up in the past 20 years, really, and really in the past 50 years to counter that, to ensure that that's surveilled and broken and, students don't get radicalized.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of elements at play there, but I mean, people talked about Occupy, and what happened to Occupy, and it's like, well, I mean, that energy is still around. I think,
Hmm.
the fact that people are talking about student loans at all means that whatever happened at Occupy, that energy is still around. But one of the reasons Occupy went away is that at least the street element of it is it just got fucking the shit beat out of it by armed police that came out of like buses with like mega Terminator gear. I mean, it's just unbelievable what was launched at that, and it was all of that was something that had been building for a long time. You saw it in the battle at Seattle in 1999 that like
Hmm.
the police were ready to fucking squash anything that was going to be like some sort of left wing action, which is, I mean, it's incredible.
Chicago '68.
Right. It just goes on and on. That's what's so fucking crazy about January 6th is like a bunch of like right wing dudes and women like just showed up and walked right into the Capitol with like over the cops. And like to me, I like if that were a left wing, like Black Lives Matter had done that, they would have had Gatling guns unleashed on that crowd. And instead, they're like sitting there being like, well, they just came in and
Hmm.
not that big a deal, which is like I don't know. It's definitely seems like the state is interested in squashing left wing movements violently, and right wing movements are kind of like,
Hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and you look at, universities don't want radical students. Universities want students who study business and medicine, not,
Right.
you know, gender studies or geography or English or something like that that might lead them to ask questions. Um, you know, it's what I think this is Mark Fisher's line about business ontology,
Mm,
right? The idea of, you are a brand and a business, and that's capitalist realism in your head. I think it's in the K-Punk essay.
yeah.
But I always think about that, about how many students before they even get to be adults are already worried about like I have to get perfect grades so I can go to medical school and have a career as a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like
Mm-hmm.
that, I knew people like that when I was 18, and I was ambitious too, but it just seems so much more intense than it was. And part of that's, USC's culture is very pre-professional, but it's got to be, from what I gather reading and talking to other professors, it's everywhere. It's not just here.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like I said, I'm still teaching that class this semester about first generation students, and they're just like it's just balls of anxiety about jobs, about what we talked about majors last week and sort of like what major should they choose. And it made me think about like I don't know if you had a major in mind when you were a freshman in college that you just like knew what you were going to major in, but like a lot of them don't know. Like they're just kind of like I don't know. I'm here. Like what should I do? And we looked at like some of the biggest majors at the school are like still psychology,
Mm.
business, sort of the type of majors that people go to like public research universities and major in, but they don't I asked them like, what is your concern with a major? Like, why would you choose one major over another? And it's entirely about sort of like how much money they might
Hmm.
make. Like it's still that, even though the students they don't visibly want to care about that, they feel like that's what they have to care about.
Well, and it flies in the face of all the evidence, which is that people who study the arts and humanities earn just as much money and are happier with their jobs,
Mm-hmm.
compared to business or engineering majors. They might make less out the gate, but if you look at 10-year, 20-year numbers, which, Chronicle of Higher Education publishes this all the time, it's ideological training that says like I can't possibly do that major because it's not good for me on the job market, even though there's no evidence that that's true, right?
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
the
Right.
evidence is that it doesn't really matter. It's more about like, what's the name on your, of the school on your diploma more than what
Right.
do you major in?
And what I try to be positive in like describing to them is that like ultimately they're getting a job is going to depend on well some connections they have realistically, but also
Hmm.
writing letters that articulate their skills. And you can major in anything and come out with a number of skills that you can articulate in a way that makes you a sort of like candidate for a lot of different types of jobs, if that makes sense. Because all of these majors, what we did on the board in class last week was sort of like put up some majors and then like try to figure out like what are the top five classes the core classes that you take for this major, and what kind of skills do you learn in those 5 classes, and then how could you use those skills to like talk about yourself as a person that can do a lot of different things. And that's sort of like the way we've been approaching it, because the reality is, like, I don't know, a general education at a 4-year school, no matter what your major, you're going to learn a lot of stuff that's not super specific to the major that you can use elsewhere. And I try to talk about it that way to them.
Yeah, I mean, I try to point out that like when you become a specialist, that's either on the job or in graduate school or both. It's not undergrad. You don't need to be worrying about like, does this major prepare me for the exact career that I want? Because chances are that career might be very different by the time you graduate. You might be training, as they say, for jobs that don't exist yet.
Yeah, you might be. I didn't know I'd be a podcaster because podcasting didn't exist when I when I went to school. But like, I mean, that seems true, and I try to think of them, try to encourage them to like tell stories about themselves and other people they know, and to go interview or talk to people that are in careers that are all going to say the same thing. Well, very few people like get the degree and go and trade it in for the job the day after they graduate. It's much more of a like, I don't know, that's a circuitous route to your career in a lot of ways, and unexpected things happen. For me, a professor gave me a book that led me to New York City. Like, I didn't think, and New York City kind of made me think about graduate school in a way I'd never had before. There are like, I don't know, things that happen along the way that change your attitude, that the attitude that college is just a job training program.
Well, and that's the cool thing about college. I mean, ideally at least, is that you never know who you're going to meet. You could meet any kind of people, whether that's a teacher or a fellow student, and chances are you're going to be influenced a lot more by your peers than by your professors because you spend more time with them. That I try to keep my students aware of, like, that's a really magical thing because a lot of adult life in America doesn't put you in that situation. If you're in a group situation, chances are it's for work to make some, asshole investor money. It's not like the same as a class where you're just asked, like, what do you think about this topic? You get to write a paper about it and someone's going to listen to you. Like, that does not happen much.
One of the things that it's funny, I'm thinking about campuses as third spaces, because some campuses are more third spacey than others, right? And there's kind of like the move to online teaching and online learning, kind of eliminates the space entirely. And I was, reading articles in like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal about like the economics of higher education now. A lot of students and families are vying for or are choosing that option, that online option, in part because they're like, I don't want to pay for the third space. Like, I don't want a dorm and a gym and all the bullshit that comes with college. We just want the teaching and learning to happen, reduced down to the pure sort of pedagogy, and that's that. And we can do that on Zoom. That to me, I don't know, because so much of what we talk about is sort of like our experience of college, you and me, Ryan, we were lucky, I think, and privileged in the sense of being able to have a third space type experience. I once, I've been to a few of those. I've been to all. In terms of schools I've actually attended, they've all been like big public schools. But I've been to on the campuses of several like small liberal arts colleges on the East Coast. Those little places. I'm so jealous of those kids. Those like Rushmore kids that like part of it is because I remember going to one of them, visiting, and like seeing the like some sort of like gathering space on the campus that was like a Lord of the Rings little hobbit nook, with a fireplace inside and books and records. And I could just imagine this place being a place where such deep kind of connections are made, and it's so cozy, and it just feels like, God, a very twee, curated craft experience that more people should have. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, college is an iceberg. There's the classes on top, and then below the water, there's all the other stuff that happens that's very often social in nature. And, saying you can just extract the pedagogy and put it online, I think, does a disservice to what education really is. It's not just what happens in the classroom. There's something about putting people together in more than just academic spaces that overlap with academic spaces. And, look who hates college students. It's, reactionaries. It's the right wing usually. I mean, I know there's more and more people who don't like higher education across the board now, but you know, there's a reason that the right is always trying to destroy these places and defund them and attack them and, treat them as the place where your kid gets indoctrinated and now their gender is weird and they don't like you anymore. And it's those Marxist professors, look who hates us.
It's funny because it's the Marxist professors to them. But what we're saying here is like, oh, if you turn college into just like the cold exchange of information that apparently the right and like neoliberals would want to turn it into, does that eliminate the Marxism? Does that eliminate the Marxist indoctrination? Because I think what you and I are saying, Ryan, is that part of the reason we developed the particular progressive values we have is because of all that third space stuff we experienced in college. Like, it wasn't just learning about gentrification or the films of Jean-Luc Godard in classes that turned me into some lefty. It was like my experiences as a person and like my experiences on campus, my experiences off campus, my experiences with my peers, honestly, more than anything. And yeah, the interactions I had with professors off campus as we were like becoming sort of a community of a small department that had like a social life to it. All of that is what indoctrinated me into Marxism, not just like a professor telling me to read Marx or something.
Yeah, I was lucky too. I mean, I just liked the idea that there was more to life than market spaces and environments and things like that the whole world teaches us to care about now. That's, capitalist realism there.
Well, I mean, I went to UCSB, so you know this campus, right? You went there too as a grad student. So I think we probably had very different experiences in a lot of ways because you were older. I was a really young 17 when I started at UCSB, and there's like a food court there. Like in like the student center, there's a food court with like a Wendy's and a Panda Express. And I mean, talk about third space. I mean, what the fuck? Like, I'm sitting here paying a lot to go to this big, cool university, and like I eat at Wendy's and Panda Express in a fucking food court alone. I could have done that at the mall in Ventura, literally, which has the exact same thing going on. There was something like corporate and bland about what they had created. It's sort of like, to me, a little bit of what we hate about what's happened to the university or cities or whatever is becoming places that are, corporate and alienating. And I couldn't wait to get to Isla Vista, honestly. Isla Vista is a much crustier kind of third place. And like the third place ends up being, for me in Isla Vista, is like actually in someone's house or like, playing Mario Kart with a bunch of guys at some apartment, that becomes the place to hang out. And I don't know, the campus was not necessarily the third space for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, a lot of this has to do with the way that a campus is integrated or not integrated with the community around it. Isla Vista is just such a special, weird, wacky place, as you know. I was kind of peripheral to it as a grad student, but like I was definitely aware that it was kind of the jungle. And yeah, there was definitely like kind of there is a dividing line, right? There's like a fence between walking over into Isla Vista from campus. It's like a low wood slatted fence now. You can hop right over it, but like, right. There's kind of a dividing line. But yeah, I was always, where I went to college was in a small town, and there's Colonial Williamsburg, and that was it. Otherwise it was just retiree.
Did like drunk kids ever go over to Colonial Williamsburg and like,
oh yes,
fuck with the reenactors?
We never did that, but it was a fun place to take like shrooms and walk around at night. Like a really like. At night, it was empty, and the security guards were pretty lax, so you could just walk around. And as long as you didn't vandalize anything, they didn't really bother you because they knew students did that. But I had some really great times just like strolling around, talking to friends, like, getting high in Colonial Williamsburg.
Yeah, that's
statute of limitations on that, I guess.
Total psychedelic space, though. Like I remember, to me, like it was totally, to be a person who grew up in Southern California, obsessed with American history, but never really going back east and seeing like where the country began. All that stuff was really mind blowing to me. And when I was like 18, I ate a bunch of weed cookies in Washington D.C. before we went out to like walk the mall for the first time. And like, man, those cookies came on when I was like standing in front of the Abraham Lincoln statue, and it's a heavy trip to think about like the foundation of the country when you're in that headspace and be like in that. Yeah, Virginia is a ripe place for American history, man. Like that's like where it happens on a number of different levels. There's like it's like when I think about Virginia, I think about the founding of the country, but also this like its role in the Civil War as like practically the capital of the Confederacy and shit. It's
so many
crazy
battles
state.
happened there.
Ugh.
Yeah, I mean, I got that Civil War Confederate crap, jammed into my brain growing up because it's a lot of the monuments have come down in places like Richmond since 2020, but there's still that culture of like, they weren't really the bad guys, right? Because,
Mhm.
they were from Virginia and that's where we're from. And, I never really bought into it once I was like old enough to think, but it's still really, really like that Confederate aura is still there. And you think about, I didn't think about it till I got older, how horrible that is for the, I think a third of Virginians who are African American, who have to look at that crap all the time. And,
Yeah, or anybody who just is not down with that, which I would hope
hmm
would be. I mean, Richmond,
yeah,
yeah, Richmond's got that huge like Hall of Heroes
yeah,
with
it's
like
got
the
Monument Avenue.
yeah, right, with the
Yeah.
big. That's where the giant like Robert E. Lee
Mhm.
statue was, right, and that's
Yep.
gone now, and the Jeff
Yep.
Davis statue. Yeah, I mean, you talk about like cultivating a public space, like Jesus Christ,
hmm
like I'm walking to school and I have to walk on Monument Avenue, like under the shadow of Confederate heroes. It's heavy. Like I don't know, cultivating a space has it's important to me, and like those statues, the Civil War statues, are one example of that history, like kind of hanging over in a very like overt way, but. To me, it's there in the Wendy's and the Panda Express too. Like it's sort of like the bad guys won, and that's why I'm sitting
hmm
here eating fucking Panda Express, um, drinking a Fruitopia. I had an incident with a Fruitopia. Do you remember Fruitopia?
I do. I don't think I ever drank one though.
I was thinking that maybe you remembered The Simpsons made a joke about Fruitopia back then that I still remember. It was like a commercial. They had like a fake commercial on Simpsons that said Fruitopia, the iced tea brewed by hippies and distributed by a heartless multinational corporation.
I remember that now. Yeah.
I had a red Fruitopia when I was like, this is like one of the first days I was at UCSB. Already feeling like a little kid, totally out of place in an adult world. And I shook my Fruitopia, and the lid came off, and like I sprayed bright red Fruitopia bullshit like all over like grad students and shit who are sitting there like working on their laptops. I mean, it was. I mean, it's up there in like top 5 most mortifying moments in my life, honestly. And I was like, fuck third places. I want to be private where no one can see me, because I'm embarrassing.
Well, and I think like thinking about alternative spaces we have now, it's like that TikTok did talk about the effort to recreate that through online platforms and how that's just a poor ersatz version of real sociality. I love Twitter. I've met some cool people through Twitter. I mean, like we met each other through
Yeah,
Twitter,
we're
but
doing
like,
Campus Trap, and
yeah,
I love these. Like what we're doing right now, where it's just like two people on a podcast, like with Zoom. Like since Zoom happened, I used to do the podcast like either in person or just by
mhm.
phone with no video. But I don't know. This
It's
makes
better
me
when you can see the other person.
totally like it's a weird space. It is weird, but like we're on. It's like we're on TV together, and we're
hmm
sort of like I don't know. I found that an hour-long conversation with someone in these spaces can be really fun, and like I enjoy that space. At the same time, I don't know. I think about that. Like yeah, online replaced the third space, but like I don't. One of the things I was thinking about, I wonder if you agree with this, Ryan, is that one of the things that's missing with the online space versus the public space is discomfort, like real, genuine discomfort, and like our bodies being in the same space as each
hmm
other, and like the discomfort feels like it might be a vital element of like the whole navigating differences in humanity in the public or something like that. I don't know if I'm being too hopeful there.
No, I think you're right. I mean, that's part of the reason I like teaching small classes with, 15 to 20 people usually. And as I always say to my students, like anything can happen in a class. Like you throw people together to talk about something, like you do not control what's going to happen, even if you're like, a very authoritarian professor, really. Um, and that can be good and bad because people can say racist things,
Yeah.
classist things, but they
Hmm.
can also say really brilliant things, or have a connection with another student of like, I didn't know you thought that too. I've seen that happen before where students realize like they have peers that are kind of on the same wavelength as them,
Yeah,
and
I
that's
think I've
that's neat to see
honestly
happen.
seen like friendships made in classes,
Hmm.
literally, where like two people in the class have like some interaction in the discussion, and then I see them like talking
Hmm.
after class, and then I see them as like bosom buddies for the rest of the semester. I love that.
Well, one of my favorite things, and I think it's a gauge of how well a class is going, is if you walk in, 5 minutes before it starts and the students are talking to each other, and I love it when I come in and the classroom's noisy. I don't care
Yeah.
if they're like messing around because they're on point as soon as I say like, let's start the class. It's when you come in and everyone's on their phone and it's just click, 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 silence. That's where it's like, I
Yes.
don't know what's wrong with the vibe here. Um,
I
once
always have to
people start
say
to,
something about it,
yeah.
like because it's like that. I have a class right now. That's it's a morning class, so I guess that's part of it. But like, it's just silent, and there's like 20
Hmm.
people sitting there in silence when I come in. When I come into the classroom, I assume no one's in it until I like turn the corner into the actual class. I'm like, oh, there's 20 people sitting here silently, and I always
Yeah.
like break. I have to break the ice, but okay, guys, I'm gonna like break the awkward silence and start talking here. Hopefully, we
Hmm.
can all get together. Like, you have to because like yeah, the discomfort element is critical, and it feels like I always feel like if I haven't overcome that discomfort in the class over the course of an hour, then I've failed in some way. Like
Hmm.
that's the goal of hanging out in public in third spaces together is to sort of like, I don't know, negotiate our awkwardness with each other and like find a common ground. That's a liberal value. I mean, that
Hmm.
really is sort of like saying that like that we can actually sort of drop our differences and find some common human element to share. I don't know. It feels like what I was gonna say is that eating. I think about eating is like seems like a pretty critical element of this. Like
Hmm.
where we talk about where we study, where we drink coffee and talk, but like where we eat together. And like COVID just like fucking decimated that. Like I went to strip mall sushi. There's a California thing to do. The other night, and there was no one eating in the actual restaurant. Like it's just takeout. Like just a giant. Like it's clear that most of the restaurants have become takeout operations that
Yeah.
like have a few tables there where some server that they hired yesterday is like gonna be the server. Like that whole world of restaurants, which seems like for better or worse, I know it's all capitalist exchange,
Hmm.
but it's still like restaurants for better or worse were like a third space for us. It seems like takeout and delivery food is just another fucking knife into this idea of
Hmm.
a vibrant public.
I feel like we need more inns and taverns. We
Yes.
need that 17th century like
That we
country
ride
pub.
horses to. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, where it's I don't want to sound like George Orwell in that essay about like his favorite non-existent pub, but there's a lot to be said for a place where you can go and maybe you spend some money, but you're not constantly urged to like refill your glass or buy more, you know, treats or coffee or whatever.
Yep.
And you can just sort of sit and you don't know who you're going to run into, right? You might read the paper and not talk to anyone, or you might get into a conversation with someone who you maybe don't like or do like. I don't know, but it could happen.
Yeah, where the fuck is that? Where are the inns and the taverns? I mean, one of the things that he mentions in that TikTok is the decline of religion and the decline of Christianity in
Hmm.
particular as like maybe one of the like broader trends that leads to this because there was such a kind of baseline um, third space as the
Hmm.
church and the institutions associated with the church. I don't know. I don't know how much you went to church growing up. I didn't really go to church all that much, but like I went to youth group and summer camps with friends, mainly because I desired social spaces and
Hmm.
social atmosphere more than the religion. But like I went to a summer camp one summer is the only time I ever did this, where my parents actually allowed me to go to this and like bit the bullet and wrote a check for some summer camp for me to go to for a week up in the woods somewhere. And one of the things that I remember most about it is that we all ate in this big hall together, and it was like a community breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. It was like we went to the hall, And when we were at the hall, we'd all eat these big tables, and then like at some point, some like person would like do some entertainment up on the stage, and we talked about what we were going to do next in the day, and of course there were prayers associated with it and things like that. But that sort of experience, which I guess is kind of like communal, like the communal experience of eating together. Fuck all the like church Christian element of it. Just the social part of it was just really, I don't know. It's very memorable to me, and it makes me feel like that's kind of what I'm seeking.
I mean, I went to church a lot. I was raised in the Episcopal Church because my family was like aspirational middle class. So you weren't a Baptist, you were Episcopal. And, I went to church a lot. But like the thing that was important to me ultimately was like the social relationships that grew out of that. And it was for my parents that way too. A lot of their friends they met that way. And it wasn't like really so much about the religious stuff. It was more just a way to meet people. With spirituality, I don't want to say thrown in. It was for me, but other people it really mattered. But yeah, you think about eating, and I think about like church picnics and coffee hour and stuff, pancake suppers, stuff like that. And I think about how on campus, one of the liveliest places is the dining halls. That's where you see lots of people still talking to each other and making noise.
Yeah, what is the eating situation like at USC? Because I mean, I mentioned the college campus I went to in Santa Barbara is University of California, giant campus. But they had a food court that you basically paid for. There were dining halls, but that was for the kids in the dorms, and I was a commuter kid. Like I didn't really live in the dorms, so like they paid into a third space there, I guess, in the dining commons. That's what's kind of interesting to me is that like rich people, elitists, no matter how much they fucking shit on colleges, they're sending their kids to campuses that have vibrant third spaces. Yep. They're sending their kids to Harvard is still going strong. I know a lot of those small liberal arts colleges have suffered a little bit, and some of them have even closed. But there's still a big market for like, in other words, I think people know that that's an enriching experience for people to have.
Yeah, I tell my students this all the time, that if you want to know what works in education, look at what wealthy people buy for their children. It's things like, small classes taught by well-compensated experts who are good at engaging with people, and it's dorms and dining halls and social spaces and being on a campus with other people. It's not online, Bill Gates didn't send his kids to do Zoom school. They get to go to fancy in-person colleges. And, I'm very cognizant of how lucky I am that I get to teach at one. Because I've not always been at an institution like this. I've been in other situations where it's not as, comfy and nice.
Yeah, the third space of the campus is somewhere that you don't want to be. I mean, that's part of what we're talking about is sort of like, a lot of what that TikTok is describing is sort of this quote unquote like decline of liberal values, but that wasn't an organic process, and it's part of like people look at crumbling public institutions at like the post office or like the DMV, and they're like, I don't want the state to pay for anything because that place fucking sucks, and like the public golf course that used to be a place that everyone paid into and we all enjoyed golfing together. Well, after private golf clubs were created, that public golf course became, the shitty place that no one took care of or paid for anymore. And that just reinforces this notion that like, well, any government space sucks and you got to basically just pay your way into the cool private place. And that self-reinforcing mechanism of the politics sucks because it contributes to more people mouthing those sorts of slogans about how they don't want to pay for this stuff. When it's like, yeah, what you described about third places and that kind of like Main Street USA, that's not just like the presence of hipsters. It's like those were like we say mom and pop. I know that's like sort of a cliche term, but like you really felt it in New York City, the years that I lived there in the kind of post 9/11 years, where you're seeing like, these vibrant like local stores closing, whether they be like dry cleaning shops or whatever that have been there for 50 years, closing, replaced by some like corporate yogurt store. There's never going to be another like working class or middle class person and family that owns this store in that neighborhood anymore because the rent is $70,000 a month, etc. It seems like the political economy of this has something to do with it as well. We're talking about it so much through individuals, and that's how people, I guess, talk about this stuff.
I always think about that that Wendy Brown book, Undoing the Demos, where the way we think about public space is shaped by the way it's actively been destroyed by the right wing of the political class in this country. The reaction against the New Deal, which was like, this country had like a shot at sort of having some public infrastructure, and even that was too much for the reaction, starting in the 70s and the 80s and continuing to now. I mean, they won.
Oh yeah, they won big time. I mean, it's kind of like, I don't know, walk around like New York City and seeing the old stone buildings and like just like the gates of Central Park, the sort of like the architecture from that era is never going to be repeated. The artistry of it. There's a the sort of famous moment in Allen Ginsberg's life where he had a nervous breakdown on the Upper West Side in an apartment near Columbia University. He heard the voice of William Blake famously, and I think he ended up in a hospital after this. But I remember him describing that moment and saying that it wasn't just the voice of William Blake. It was looking out his window and seeing like the ornate brick construction of the building across the street that was just some like working class people's apartment building, and the beauty of it. And he said he could comprehend and feel the intelligence of the like immigrant workers' hands who had created this building, and all of those millions of hands, appeared in his mind, and he sort of like had some sort of fit. But either way, I can totally get that, because I don't know if you ever watched like this movie, The Cruise. Like,
I love that movie.
Yeah, right.
Timothy
like,
Levitch.
Yeah. It's totally that, right? Like, it seems like that moment is connects with that, and it's part of what drew me to New York. Honestly, is that notion of like the magic of humanity that had built this place. I don't really feel that in terms of the building of these places anymore, L.A. or New York or any other cities in the U.S., where it's sort of like, it doesn't seem like that's the driving engine of creating the city anymore. There are places that are just emptied out shells for capital to rip us off more.
Yeah, it's just a way to extract as much money as possible from rents. And, it's rentier capitalism, and it doesn't enable, it destroys like sociality. It turns us all into like little consuming monads bouncing around the neighborhood, and then grabbing our food and going back to our apartment to watch HBO or whatever.
Yeah, like fucking rodents, like just zipping out, getting
scurrying back with my burger.
Yeah, it's a pretty bleak vision, and that TikTok. Thanks for talking about it with me, Ryan, because I felt like that TikTok brought up a lot of ideas for me in terms of my entire life of thinking about and longing for certain types of spaces. And honestly, college campuses feel like such a potential to be this place. And I know they do serve as that place for a lot of people, but there's, I don't know, the rest of the world too to think about.
Yeah, colleges are funny. I mean, they're creatures of modern capitalism, but they're also spaces that aren't entirely colonized by capital, and I think that's special about them.
Right. It's like we the city gone. It's the capital city, the real estate state. But the colleges, there's hope in the colleges. Yeah, I mean I can think that's part of why, like, in my more fantastical imagination and reveries, I think about colleges as sort of like the last stand. This is where, like, when the zombie war comes. Or The Stand, with Stephen King, where some people went to Vegas and some people went to Boulder. I feel like some people would go to college campuses and like this is where we make our stand, because they seem like, I don't know, there's a movie or novel there about like the college campuses as the like last stand of civilization, one way or the other.
I mean, they're already kind of bunkers and they're fortified, so they would make excellent defensive positions.
Totally, yeah. I mean, just from a like strategic point of view, for sure. Thank you, Ryan. We will enter the campus trap again very soon, I'm sure. But good to see you.
It was great talking. Take care, man.